waiting room. I'm going to admit him.
Yes, we're
Okay.
waiting for people in. Okay.
All right. I'm going to go on mute now. Good luck there and have loads of fun.
Thank you, darling. Oh, shit.
Get along if you just don't put your mouse on it. You leave your mouse out, so it will just disappear.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everybody in the room and everybody who's joined us online. I'd like to thank our team from the Cannabis Embassy and Fields of Green for All, our technical team down in Cape Town at the Cannabis Expo, and out in the mountains, our technical team driving the Zoom program. So thanks very much again. We've only got very limited time, and I'd like to just apologize in advance if the video, the sound on the video is not great. If you do have earphones, if you can please just use those, it should improve the sound. Biopiracy designates the illegitimate and/or illegal appropriation of genetic resources and/or associated traditional knowledge. Riamba, dacha, hemp, marijuana, bang, canopy, cannabis sativa L, along with numerous other crop plants, is deeply ingrained in traditional knowledge systems and represents genetic resources possibly associated with the intellectual property rights of small-scale farmers. We are very honored to have Professor Chris Duval send us a video. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us today, and I see that he is online on the Zoom. But he sent us this very comprehensive video, which I'm going to share with you now.
What I'd like for us to talk about today, or what I'd like us to think about, is how plant knowledge, the role it has in emerging cannabis economies worldwide. My background and interest is in Africa, and looking at people in Africa use plants and influence about the knowledge globally. So that's kind of what I'm focusing my attention. Now, as a really brief outline of my talk today, the main message that I want to frame is that the relatively new global cannabis industry, increasingly legal. Because it is new, we are able at this point now to build an equitable foundation for it. And so that's what I'd like us to think about, is how we can structure the emerging economy so that it looks fairer now and in the future. Now, to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about concepts aspect of piracy, thinking about how these are different and related. I'll talk really briefly about the history of cannabis in Africa, and then look again briefly at the role of Africa and African knowledge in the legal cannabis markets worldwide. And so the first thing to underscore is the plant knowledge. Plant biodiversity is very valuable to people. This is the basis of agriculture. It enables agricultural sustainability. It enables human well-being through the production of food, but also through the production of medicines and other products that we rely upon. This is prominent mainstream agriculture. This gives a quote and some imagery from an initiative called the Agricultural Green Revolution for Africa, which is really emphasizing how to improve agricultural productivity in the continent with all its downstream effects and impacts on human health and well-being through nutrition. And it really emphasizes the importance of crop biodiversity. Now, in the cannabis sphere and in cannabis agriculture worldwide, plant diversity is very highly valued by both users and growers and all. So revisit this and talk about this later in my talk now, but there are a number of popular strains of psychoactive cannabis. Malawi Gold is the example here. And there's lots of informal reviews of these strains and discussions of African cannabis knowledge on the internet. This characteristic, this subjective effect that's described in this quote of feeling energized, of having appetite suppression is what's being talked about in this quote. This is a subjective effect, and they all return to several times and want us to think a little bit about what produces this effect in relation to both plant chemistry, but also the agricultural knowledge that people have in association with this plant. Now, plant biodiversity, it can enter markets. Obviously, we have local to global plant products. There's two processes that can be important in how plant biodiversity enters into market situations and becomes economically valuable. In broad terms, the starting point a lot of times is this activity called bioprospecting, which is simply the act of going out and looking for potentially valuable plants, genetic resources we can think of as really the underlying diversity that we're thinking about. Now, bioprospecting often leads to commercialization. In order to pursue commercial development, there's a number of things, of course, that need to be done. One that's important I want to draw your attention to is the establishment and determination of property rights, both intellectual property, but also rights to the genetic resources and the seeds, in some sense, in some cases, that enable the plants to be grown. Now, one form, I guess, of determination of property rights is biopiracy, right? And this is really kind of a seizure of appropriation of property rights by powerful entities, right? Companies, corporations, individuals, business people. But it's important to underscore that these rights in this way are appropriate. They're taken, right? They enter into fully external control as opposed to other ways of determining property rights, which can include, complete local or indigenous control of valuable resource or some form of shared control. And really this, again, what I want us to think about is biopiracy as a way of kind of how cannabis has been appropriated in some contexts from the local and indigenous communities that maintain the seeds and the seed stock and the crop diversity that people value. All right, so part two of what I'd like to talk about is a very brief history of cannabis in Africa. Cannabis has a long history in the continent. It arrived in East Africa sometime between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, coming from South Asia. It has a longer history in Asia of domestication, up to 10,000 years ago in parts of Southern and Eastern Asia. So the kind of concerns that I'm raising about biopiracy and bioprospecting are relevant to other parts of the world, even though, again, my emphasis and focus is on Africa. Now, how do we understand diversity? How can we perceive diversity on a continental scale? That's difficult. One way of thinking about it and kind of visualizing it is looking at the different terms that are used for cannabis across the continent. We can see a number of different general roots for cannabis terms spoken across the continent. Each of these general terms we can think of as kind of being a complex or a set of agricultures and cultures associated with the plant, with different levels of crop diversity. But then also each of the points on this map are different languages, and we can think about languages approximately cultural groups, and within each of these cultural groups we can think of multiple types of interaction with cannabis, which means potentially at least multiple types of plant. Crop diversity is kind of something we can look at as being associated with human diversity, cultural diversity in particular. Okay. Now the map of language terms here, this is an outcome of human migration and the plant migration that accompany those human migrations. And so we look at kind of the vectors of cannabis dispersal. Historically, we can see a number of different kind of processes that were important in carrying the plant around. These that I've indicated here are really just the ones that are relatively obvious in historical documentation. Trade, of course, was very important. It's important for many, or if not all, plants that travel with people. And what's important to think about in the context of biodiversity and bioprospecting, biopiracy, is that the current varieties of plants that we have, of cannabis in particular, these were the result, or these arose as a result of farmers breeding the crop in order to meet needs, the demands of the people who are using the plant, right? And so, if people used it in a certain context, looked for certain effects, then the plant growers would select plants that met those needs, right? And so the diversity that we see nowadays within cannabis and other plants, that really reflects or gives us kind of an insight into historical practices that people have of both using and producing the plant. Now, with regard to cannabis in Africa, the best documented historical users were hard laborers. There was, the plant was used in other contexts. We just don't know as much about it because of, the way that the historical record was produced. But we do have a very good indication of how historical laborers valued the plant, right? And so the photo here is of a man who was a porter in Angola. He was posing for a picture. He would carry that photo on his head. And photos you see of men working in situations like this that usually have a little box or something carried on their waist. Those are described historically as where they store their smoking supplies, their pipes, the smoking material. So we have this visual record, but we also have a really rich written record of the value that people had for cannabis in Africa. And this goes back to the late 16th century, Mozambique in the 1580s. Portuguese travelers discussing how people in Mozambique used the plant for appetite suppression, right?
again, this is a common description of subjective effects that people experience with the plants grown in South and Southeastern Asia, Africa, excuse me. Recalling that very recent quote that I gave earlier about a traveler, marijuana aficionado who traveled to that part of the world and found a similar sort of subjective effect of appetite suppression. Now, this characteristic of the plant effect was associated with political economies, and in the African context, the association of cannabis with hard labor, particularly the slave trade, was very prominent historically. And so we have a number of descriptions of how cannabis had a role in slave trading. This quote is with regard to Angola. The image also is from Angola, but both slaves and their captors, the slavers, valued cannabis for managing slave health to some extent. It was used as a stimulant, as an appetite suppressant, as a way to get people to survive somewhat better than they would without it. And again, this type of effect that's described historically, that underlies the diversity that we see nowadays in the plant and value nowadays in the plant. And just to kind of wrap up the history portion, it's important to understand that there's an association with slave trading in Africa extended across the Atlantic. And so we have accounts of how the seeds traveled with people across the Atlantic. These quotes are from Gabon in Brazil, right? And so another kind of value that people had that is associated with the plant is that the seeds travel fairly well also. But again, what we're seeing nowadays in terms of the biodiversity that people value has historical roots. So the third part I want to talk about is the role that African knowledge and African cannabis have in global cannabis economies nowadays. Africa is very productive. It produces a large portion of the global cannabis crop, and nearly all of that production is for domestic African markets. Most of the production, nearly all of the production, is kind of subsistence oriented. It tends to be dominated by poorer farmers who grow it as what's called a compensation crop. And so if they're not able to earn enough money through legal crops and food crops, they turn to cannabis because it does generate income fairly reliably. And so descriptions that we have of farmers in Africa, these are the people who are conserving biodiversity, maintaining biodiversity through their seed choices. These are people who are using, are growing cannabis in order to supply their household with the cash that they need. And so this quote is from a woman in Lesotho who describes paying for school fees through growing cannabis. Africa is a frontier in cannabis bioprospecting. And again, what I mean by bioprospecting here is going out looking for potential value in natural resources. This is dominated by private concerns because of the legal, historic, and present legal status of cannabis in countries and globally. There's a lot of websites that are focused on cannabis and marijuana that talk about Africa as being this place where you can find great diversity of strains, that people see a lot of potential in commercial development. And so you have actual companies that go out and fund bioprospecting. I'll mention this company, which is known as Train Hunters from the Netherlands. They go out and they look for cannabis potentially build into their commercial enterprises and activities. So again, the value that people had historically in cannabis is what people value nowadays. And so this long history of cannabis in Africa has produced value and, persists not just in the seeds and the plant genetics, but also in the knowledge of people to produce these plants. And so, this top quote is from, somebody who's just a marijuana aficionado writing about this on the internet, right? The THCV or tetrahydrocannabinol is a particular characteristic of many Southern African cannabis varieties. It's an unusual cannabinoid, and there's a lot of interest in it for medical applications. This paper below is looking at it specifically for dietary management in association with obesity. And again, this is something that originated in Africa due to the values that past people have in this kind of subjective effect. Yeah. Now, historically, African cannabis has been valued externally for some time now. For the most part, it has gained value internationally, globally through Biopiracy, which again is kind of a commercial development where the property rights associated with the seeds and the genetic diversity is appropriated by outsiders, right? And so a good example is this varietal called bourbon poison, which is very prominent in dispensaries in the global north here in the United States. In particular, this traces back to South African white expatriates who left their country to come to Amsterdam to begin developing cannabis industry there. And from there, the seed was transported globally, went into selective breeding practices, and has become one of the most popular strains, again, in the US particularly, but elsewhere as well. And of course, they're not giving it out for free. It's highly valued. So, here's an example where you can have that strain delivered to you if you are in San Francisco, right? And this is a highly valuable material. Now, African cannabis is undervalued in African economies, which really enables biopiracy. And so, even though there's been liberalization of drug control laws in some African countries, it's very clear by the governments in those countries that they're not legalizing or authorizing the types of cannabis, the traditional practices and uses associated with it. And so when people go to buy a prospect, they have to take the seeds, smuggle the seeds out of the country. And that's what the strain hunters and other bioprospectors do. The strain hunters and others also recognize that this lack of freedom for African growers is what enables kind of inequity within the global cannabis industry, right? And so because this industry is new, we have the opportunity to build an equitable foundation. Really needs to be driven by the people who are producing the cannabis and maintaining the diversity, not outsiders like me, but some of the things that could be thought of is establishing more protections for the people, for the products that they grow. Things such as protecting geographic appellations, enabling kind of market-based negotiations for seeds and seed exports rather than smuggling that was characterized it. And then making sure that there are some mechanism to give royalties back to communities, and really making it so that they can pursue their agriculture within their countries. So that's that. Again, I wish I was there at the end with you, but good luck in the conference, and I look forward to questions in the discussion here that we'll have coming up.
Thank you very much, Professor Duval. And I'd like to just make the point now in the room that what Professor Duval is saying is also particularly valid for coca leaf and also for opium poppy, the plants, fungi that are under international control. So it's not only cannabis. For the last 13 years of being a cannabis activist, I've developed a really close relationship with the people of Mpondo land. Unfortunately, due to severe lack of resources, the farmers that I'm connecting with are 3 hours walk from the nearest road with no internet connection. It is one of my dreams to get some of those members of that community to Vienna one day. And we certainly hope that those with the resources will help us to do that. But in lieu of having some of our farmers here in the room with us today, or in lieu of having them online, because that is also impossible, they have sent me a statement. And unfortunately, I can't read the whole statement out, but we are going to be publishing this video on the Fields of Green for All YouTube channel and across our social media. So please follow us on social media and you will get the full presentation of the whole cannabis and biopiracy. So protecting the rights of ancestral farmers in Mpondo land. In the lush landscapes and on the rolling mountains of Mpondo land, South Africa, cannabis cultivation has been a traditional practice for centuries, deeply knotted with the cultural heritage and livelihoods of ancestral farmers and their families, an immensely valuable plant of the first people, if you will. However, for decades now, the exploitation of indigenous cannabis phenotypes by external entities and global players without any proper recognition or compensation to the local communities has raised serious concerns about biopiracy and the infringement of ancestral farmers' rights. But the cannabis community stood by silently until today. And so the Mzimvubu Farmers Support Network will stand in solidarity with Fields of Green for All and others as we continue to advocate for the protection of these indigenous farmer rights by highlighting the significance of ancestral indigenous knowledge, sustainable cultivation practices, and community empowerment in the context of cannabis biopiracy and in Mpondo land and elsewhere in South Africa, such as Swaziland, Lesotho, Malawi, to name just a few. It is therefore imperative that all stakeholders present here today work together to ensure that these ancestral farmers receive the recognition, support, and compensation they rightfully deserve for their invaluable contributions to cannabis cultivation and conservation in Mpondo land, whose people's generational stewardship of cannabis has served the global cannabis community well, like the pleasant farm worker and provider she'll no longer accept to be. With love from the Mzimvubu Farmers Support Network nonprofit company. I'd like to introduce Jenna Rose Astwood. She's an Indigenous researcher from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you for joining us, Jenna Rose.
Please bear with us while we play this game of musical chairs. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai and welcome. My name is Jenna Rose Maharata Astwood. I'm an Indigenous Māori researcher from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm an adopted member of the Indigenous delegation with a plug-in to the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance. I would first like to have a disclaimer. I will not be talking about cannabis in my presentation. Why? It leads me to acknowledge Fields of Green for All and the rest of the Cannabis Embassy for giving me this platform for the Indigenous voice and to share our shared concerns on the space of biopiracy. I really just want to lift up the fields of green for all, like they have given me the space to lift the Indigenous voice at CND. So I am here on behalf of Rangiwaho Marae, an Indigenous community in New Zealand, a Māori Indigenous community, who are fighting for their rights to utilize a traditional medicine in therapy on tribal lands for treatment of methamphetamine abuse among members of the Indigenous community. This traditional medicine that they want to use is a psilocybin mushroom found only in New Zealand. It was named Wereroa by its Western discoverer, but is known as whare atua to the Indigenous community. It is a unique mushroom, identified as one of the oldest and ancient species of mushroom that exist on this planet. It is incredibly sacred to the Rangiwaho Marae community, and its protection is of their highest priority as a biological heritage and the protection of biological diversity. However, Rangiwaho Marae face many challenges by drug regulation in their quest to practice, administer, and protect this traditional medicine. The mushroom is prohibited under New Zealand Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, where psilocybin is scheduled as a Class A drug, encompassing the highest forms of prohibition. In their quest to use traditional medicine and therapy, they also face barriers of clinical requirements and licenses, capability development and practitioner development among their community, and of course, financial support. The biggest barrier, however, is the systematic colonization, prejudice, and oppression of Indigenous peoples and their practices, and the intergenerational battle for self-determination from which all of these challenges stem from. Well, I could talk for hours and days about this. It is not the focus of my presentation, but it is important for me to lay that foundation. Today, I will focus specifically on one of the major concerns of the Rangiwaho Marae community, which is the lack of protective mechanisms in place for traditional knowledge and Indigenous biodiversity. Clip, clip, flip. Oh, excellent. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So just briefly, from a Māori Indigenous perspective, we see ourselves as descendants of nature, and because of this, we have an inherent obligation to care for it. It is what we are given when we are born from birth. We're inherited from generations as descendants of the land. Indigenous peoples have traditional knowledge systems, and for Māori people, it is called mātauranga Māori. It is a distinctly unique set of experiences formed over generations and passed down intergenerationally. It is formed by experience, knowledge, trial, and error. It is over 800 years old in New Zealand mātauranga Māori. As part of our concepts in terms of rongoā here, which is known as traditional medicine, and taonga, which is known as a sacred object. So our traditional medicines are identified as sacred objects and therefore our biological heritage. So our major concerns with biopiracy and relating to drug prohibition and prospecting for new drugs is the appropriation of Indigenous knowledge without consent or participation. We have seen this happen time and time again throughout our history. The lack of protective mechanisms in place for biological heritage from bioprospecting for new drugs. The exposing of Indigenous knowledge holders and practitioners creates a vulnerability to criminalization and exploitation. Something that I heard yesterday at a workshop that was presented about Indigenous peoples in the Amazon being forced into drug trafficking because of their knowledge of the forest. This is an incredibly vulnerable space for them to be in, and we need to be conscious of that. What needs to happen? So I'm the first person to plug Indigenous self-determination because my people have been fighting for it intergenerationally. And in our context, we believe that this is due to us. We signed the treaty with the British Crown in 1840, which promised us partnership, and we have never received such partnership. And this is why we push for more than just engagement and consultation, but participation and partnership. And I implore everybody here to think the same in terms of Indigenous peoples and working with their communities around traditional medicines. Access and benefit sharing is also really important in terms of providing provision for the communities in which this knowledge and biological heritage come from. Indigenous peoples are wanting to share their knowledge with the world, but done so safely and done so in a way that is reciprocal. And of course, one of the later speakers will talk further on the Nagoya Protocol, which is very important. It's important to ensure that there are protection measures in place for biological heritage. In New Zealand at the moment, there is nothing to stop any type of bioprospecting or biopiracy from coming in and exploiting the plethora of endemic flora and fauna species we have that have notable and known as a traditional medicine and potentially contain compounds for the further synthesizing or isolating for modern medicine. If you're looking for any guidance in this place, please refer to these documents. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 24, calls for the Indigenous rights of traditional medicines, maintain Indigenous health practitioners, and the conservation of vital medicinal plants. The Matatua Declaration on Cultural Intellectual Property Rights of Indigenous Peoples was the first ever intellectual property rights conversation by Indigenous peoples globally. It declares that Indigenous peoples of the world have the right to self-determination, and in exercising that must be recognized as the exclusive owners of their cultural and intellectual property. The ILO, Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, adopts a calls for the adoption of appropriate measures to safeguard Indigenous institutions, cultures, and environments, and the International Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy, promotion of cultural life without discrimination, including access to and preservation of cultural goods where these involve controlled plants and substances. So please refer to these documents when you are trying to advocate for this in the policy space or anywhere in the advocacy space for that matter. So I'm going to leave you today with a very important story about how, if none of that happens, we could see the demise and loss of endemic species worldwide, causing a massive impact to Indigenous communities, cultural identity, cultural well-being. These birds are known the huia bird. They are a very special native bird to New Zealand. And their tail feathers were often found in the heads of our leaders and our chiefs of our community. Now, during the process of colonization, it was recognized by those wealthy settlers that this adornment was a sign of respect. And so what they did is they took that tail feather, they put it in their hat, and they returned to the United Kingdom. Now, as a consequence of this, people started a fashion trend. And a whole line of hunters came to New Zealand and proceeded to hunt down this bird. And now the huia is extinct. This is an impact of what biopiracy can have with lack of protection. This was one of our most sacred birds that no longer exists anymore. So I really implore everybody in this room, advocates, allies, policymakers, activists, or all of the above, please take into consideration the concerns of Indigenous peoples in terms of biopiracy. Please be conscious when you're having conversations about conservation in the environment that you take into consideration the cultural and identity importance of flora and fauna in the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenna Rose. That was an incredibly touching presentation. Our next speaker's name is David Watson, and he's somewhat camera shy. You know, a lot of us of the older generation have a hangover from prohibition. But he did send us a very endearing photograph and a voice message. Again, we apologize for the quality of the sound, but we've done the best that we can. And David Watson is known as Sam the Skunk Man. So some of you might know him as that.
Hello, I am David Watson. I started the first cannabis seed company in the world, Sacred Seeds, started in California in 1975. I am not sure if you know of the UN Biodiversity Act, first signed by 150 nations in 1992, something that many in the cannabis community would like to do is to repay the grower folks that we got the seeds of Acapulco, Gold, Panama Red, Afghani, and other landrace varieties from in the beginning of the 1960s. But that is impossible, and in fact, they were just temporary custodians. The varieties were developed by thousands of growers over hundreds of years in the local land areas of the world. How can they ever be repaid? They cannot, as many of, or most of them are already dead. An important part of the biodiversity debate involves access to and sharing of the benefits arising out of commercial and other utilization of these genetic materials, such as pharmaceutical products. Most of the world's cannabis biodiversity is found in developing countries. The UN Biodiversity Convention, first signed in 1992, recognizes national sovereignty over all genetic resources and provides that access to valuable biological resources be carried out on mutually agreed terms and subject to the prior informed consent of the country of origin. When a microorganism, plant, or animal is used for commercial application, the country and growers from which it came has the right to benefit. Such benefits can include cash, samples of what is collected, the participation or training of national researchers, the transfer of biotechnology equipment and know-how, and shares of any profits from the use of the resources. Work has begun to translate this concept into reality, and there are already examples of benefit sharing arrangements. Many countries have established controls over access to their genetic resources, and an equal number of nations are developing such controls. Amongst the examples, the Philippines, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Venezuela have adopted laws and measures to regulate access to their genetic resources. The bioprospector is required to meet certain conditions. This treaty grew out of the earlier work by the Nayoga Project on access to genetic resources and the fair and equal sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. The protocol was adopted on 29th of October 2010 at Nayoga, Japan, during the 10th meeting of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity is an international agreement which aims at sharing the benefits arising from utilization of genetic resources in a fair and an equitable way. The convention entered into force on 29 December 1993, which was 90 days after the 30th ratification. What does this all mean if you go to India or Afghanistan today and collect seeds and do collecting under the UN Biodiversity Convention? You must share the profits and information about the genetics collected with the local governments as well as the local farmers. As far as I know, no cannabis seed has done this yet, myself included, but I did collect my cannabis seed collections before the UN Biodiversity Act was signed or put into force. I did collect in most traditional cannabis production areas, such as Mexico, South America, Morocco, Turkey, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Cambodia, Korea, etc. My seeds are legal, being grandfathered into legality. I have often thought about how to share with the farmers. To be honest, I have little interest in sharing profits with the governments that for decades kept cannabis illegal and jailed the users and growers and sellers. To me, that is a bit absurd, but it is required. I always tried to be fair with the growers, farmers. I was honest about why I wanted the seeds and what I planned to do with them. The growers never seemed to mind at all. I often bought many kilos of superior cannabis flowers from the local farmers of Cincinnati gone to land races, just to find a few hundreds of seeds of that land-based variety by grinding and screening the flowers to collect any seeds they had. With hashish farmers, collecting seeds was very easy because they grow seeded plants by the thousands, and therefore the seeds are very available. I do hope that current land-based collectors will try and comply and share their profits with the growers in the traditional cannabis cultivation areas. It seems a decent thing to do besides being required under the U.S. Biopiracy Convention.
Thank you very much, David, if you're watching. Our last speaker tonight is perhaps somebody who is most knowledgeable about the subject today. And I'm very proud to introduce you to Kenzie Ribeleza-Morley of the Cannabis Embassy FAT and General Biodiversity Knowledge. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. So I wanted to make you an update. Importantly, we are here at the Commission on Narcotic Drug, obviously a forum where we are talking about three treaties related to drug control. But in the case of plants and fungi under international control, products that exist in nature, we also have other treaties, other complementary legal environment. And in particular, we have one that affects plants and farmers, plants and people, and attempt to fight against biopiracy. So we have had already a series of mention of international law. Jenna Rose, Sam the Skunkman. I mean, it's interesting to see that this is a topic that is being seized by advocates and by people involved. So I will not get back to you on that. Plus, we have limited time. This is on the left. You can see the image, which it comes from a workshop we did before the CND on biopiracy. It sort of attempts to represent the two spheres of possible biopiracy. So on this circle at the bottom, you will see on the left in green biopiracy that can relate to what we call genetic resources, which is perhaps a too utilitarian term to refer to nature and plants and biological heritage. And we have on the other side in blue the traditional knowledge, which is immaterial knowledge, immaterial know-hows associated with these resources, with these plants and fungi. And so we have a number of treaties that affect these two areas of potential biopiracy. But importantly, I wanted to raise your attention to this future GRATK treaty. It's a complex acronym as often. It will be negotiated in May in Geneva. And it's, I think, something people interested in drug policy reform should pay attention to. I put you here on the right of the screen, the first page of the position paper that the Cannabis Embassy coordinated for the negotiation of this treaty. And you heard, if you were here on the first day, the vice president of Bolivia announcing that they were also going to have an important advocacy presence in May in Geneva. So we don't know yet because the treaty is not yet negotiated, but after May, there are chances that we will have a hopefully positive and helpful treaty that will avoid, as you can see here on the left, on the top left in green, that will avoid mostly patents, or at least force the disclosure of people attempting to patent products or ideas that come from from genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. So it will not if the treaty is well done, which is still to be seen, and which requires your involvement as well, we would not in the future be able to patent inventions that would not have been possible without the genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, without asking the permission and obtaining prior informed consent and a series of mechanisms for benefit sharing. So yeah, maybe to leave a bit of room for discussion or questions. I think probably the good idea is to give all of us a sort of meeting next year when we will have, or at a later date, when we will have this treaty negotiated, perhaps into force, and it's probably important to always keep in mind that not only we have obviously declaration on human rights and a series of non-binding instruments that we need to use to interpret drug control as a protective, as enabling protection for indigenous people and local communities who have this biological heritage. We need also to take into account instruments like the Nagoya Protocol that has been mentioned, or this future GRATK treaty that are binding, that will be binding, and that must be taken into account when we reform cannabis laws and other natural drugs law. For instance, Nagoya Protocol is a treaty that already has a series of dispositions to fight against biopiracy and the misappropriation of natural resources. And it is in force in the European Union, and I have not seen it articulated in any of the regulations of cannabis that have been passed recently in the European Union, which is probably a missed opportunity. So inviting you to reconsider this, and again, we will post a more complete and a more detailed video online if you're interested to dig deeper into this issue. So thank you for participating. We probably have the time for a question or two. We probably have the time for a question or two, but before that, I wanted to invite you to not leave this room under any circumstance. Because just after we have a side event organized by the indigenous delegation, which is going to probably add a lot of elements to the discussion that we just initiated here. And in case you really want to have a walk and wake up, we also invite you to go next in the next lobby just on the left to a side event on the post Philippines atrocious drug war killings and how to handle the next step in the Philippines. But maybe there are some questions in the room before we finish. Maybe not. So, yeah, shortly.
Farid K-West from England. I just would like to mention, but maybe give more details about this luncheon that is organized or is welcoming Jazz Pharmaceutical. What role this company has here?
Yes, well, as we are talking here about attempting to fight against biopiracy, indeed, elsewhere in this same compound, we have a large multinational pharmaceutical company who has intellectual property rights over cannabis-derived products. So this question of biopiracy is not just theoretical, as we see, it's already something that exists, and yeah. I think we have to perhaps take a last question over here.
Reparations for biopiracy there's already been so much biopiracy that's happened in the past 500 years. Are there any international legal frameworks that exist yet to pursue reparations for that?
Thanks. That's actually an excellent question. Yes and no. So no, a priori, we don't have retroactivity in law generally. So the Nagoya Protocol is not retroactive, for instance. The Nagoya Protocol is the best treaty that we have now to fight effectively against biopiracy, but it only applies from the moment that it enters into force. However, though, the Bolivian government has suggested the Bolivian vice president in its statement on last Thursday, which in my opinion was the best statement of the whole CND, actually suggested perhaps this activation of the Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol, which is maybe too complex now, and we have the other side even coming in, but the Article 10, depending on how it is activated, it could indeed provide us a framework to address things from the past, but it's a complicated issue. So hopefully next year we have the opportunity to make another side event and continue this discussion. But yes, it's important to consider. It's important to consider it as two different areas of law: biopiracy from now on, and then historical reparation from the past. It's also important, but these are sort of two different things. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And we loved having you here. And please stay in touch with Fields of Green for All, NCOD, and the Cannabis Embassy. Thanks.
Stop it. Us in time, the first in time thing that's happened in the whole week.
Hello, Chris.
All right.
Okay,
Hi there. Thank you for organizing this. I'm really sorry I couldn't travel.
Oh, yes. Well, maybe next time we can give you some more notice and
Yeah, that would be
join
great.
us.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just have a bunch of travel. I just got back a couple days ago and I'm leaving again the day after tomorrow. So
Oh,
it's
well,
yeah, it's great to see all the work that people are doing and learning about you know, the presentation from Aotearoa, New Zealand is great.